So, the last couple of weeks we've spent some time with John Locke and his thoughts concerning education, and now we're going to look at Rousseau's views on education through his masterpiece, Emile. Emile was written partly in response to Locke's ideas on education, but it's done in a different way, through a story. It's kind of a tragic story, but along the way it's got lots of twists and turns, and it's quite interesting and even amusing. But scholar Judith Sklar says, to sum it up, Emile, brought up so carefully to be a man, in this book, he leaves his rural abode, and he and his wife destroy their marriage in Paris. So it's sad. It tells the story of how even the best educated and best brought up person becomes corrupted by modern bourgeois society and its values. More than any other work by Rousseau, Emile explores the impact of liberal progress on individuals, and particularly upon families. It depicts his greatest attempt to engineer both individuals and families using a model contrary to that progress, and with the express aim of withstanding modern corruption. The book gives us the best perspective on Rousseau's divided mood, both his hope that at least some individuals can withstand modernity and still be happy, and his sadness and indeed despair that after all, they most likely cannot. Doing so, he gives us a glimpse into our own divided mood. So let's take a look at Emile's education, starting in early childhood. Rousseau's early childhood education is at once both natural and also pretty manipulative. He advocates what educators would now call experiential learning of various subjects. Many of us think that experiential learning is more easygoing, but this is not the case with Rousseau's approach. His recommendations are quite forceful and intrusive. It's wrong to think that he wants the child to grow up like a weed. Instead, the child is treated more like a bonsai tree, carefully trained and controlled, with a definite design in mind. If Rousseau wants the child to do or not to do something, he gives him no options, thus getting him used to submitting to necessity with calm resignation. The teacher should allow the child to learn the direct consequences of his words and deeds, such as the lack of trust that comes after a lie. Always lurking in the background, Rousseau surreptitiously makes sure that experience and reason always lead the young man to the right conclusions. He says, "Remember that the spirit of my education consists not in teaching the child many things, but in never letting anything but accurate and clear ideas enter his brain. I put truths into his head only to guarantee him against the errors he would learn in their place." So this is not freewheeling education where the child really learns on his own, but a sort of sophisticated naturalistic manipulation, almost like a Platonic education, the education that Plato would give the guardian class. Everything is chosen specifically to develop certain ideas and a certain character in the small child, who is very malleable at that point. Now, Rousseau agrees with John Locke in some details about how a child should be raised. For instance, he recommends that young children be bathed in the cold and even freezing water, and become accustomed to the environment by not being swaddled or kept from the cold. This is an attempt to make children as hardy so that they'll grow up to be hardy adults. Also, in his role as the governor of Emile, he warns against giving in to children's demands. He does not want them spoiled and soft. A child needs to experience deprivation. He should be taught how to be happy without having much. His teacher knows that to give children everything they want is to make them miserable, especially when they grow up and find out that the world doesn't work like their old household. Rousseau's goal is not to produce the bourgeois person, who knows how to delay gratification so that he can receive more things in the long run, but literally to produce a person who does not value things very highly and can survive and be happy with very little. And that's the main difference there. Locke is trying to, as we know, develop the gentleman who can engage productively in commerce, and Rousseau is basically trying to produce the type of person who is personally self-sufficient by not needing very many things. Children should learn to entertain themselves, he says, so that they may learn early the value of independence, which is more important than material security. Rousseau's ideal child is a type of savage recognizable to readers of his discourses, a savage who is quick both physically and mentally because necessity is his teacher, or rather, Rousseau is his teacher, who secretly manipulates necessity. He also resembles a savage in his enjoyment of life. Again, Rousseau emphasizes the happiness of the moment in order to criticize the liberal bourgeois mentality that encourages and admires delayed gratification. Who knows how long we'll live, he reasons. So why do we burden children and youth with unnecessary lessons they cannot really fathom at their age anyway? For reasons other than Locke's, Rousseau advocates the natural learning of language through example, rather than employing rigorous lessons in grammar and usage from an early age. He too sees the studying of Greek and Latin as a useless pastime of the rich, or an artificial source of inequality. All early learning ought to be connected directly with what the child needs and finds useful. Rousseau wrote, "At 12, Emile will hardly know what a book is, but it will be said he certainly must at least know how to read. I agree. He must know how to read when reading is useful to him. Up to then, it is only good for boring him." Rousseau sounded like he was speaking from experience there. In Rousseau's view, Emile, like all children, was born with the ability to be good, and he disagrees with Hobbes and Locke in their understanding of human nature as fairly fixed and irrevocably selfish. The aim of his education should be to help the child avoid becoming evil. Evil comes from the introduction of hypocrisy and other syndromes brought on by modern society. The outcome of his education should be self-governance, not a particular knowledge set. So here we have a fairly strong liberal theme, whereby education is for creating the independent person, the independent thinker, a person deep enough to understand what's going on, not just simply someone who can plug into a particular job. Disagreeing directly with Hobbes, but in agreement with much of modern educational thought, Rousseau says that all wickedness comes from weakness. By assuring that Emile grows up hardy and strong and self-possessed, Rousseau thinks he assures that the boy will never have any need of wickedness. Rousseau promises that when he gets done with Emile, he'll be all that a man should be. Emile will know best how to endure both the good and the bad fortune that life throws his way. He will find happiness in making his desires conform to his ability to attain them, and not in the Lockean view that one's desires will expand with the expansion of one's productivity. A child's early education should not involve moral lessons and should also not revolve around orders and obedience. He says, thus the words obey and command will be proscribed from his lexicon, and even more so duty and obligation, but strength, necessity, impotence, and constraint should play a great role in it. Here's where Rousseau's modern view on moral issues fully reveals itself. The most fundamental source of restraint, the one that we should emphasize when forming our children's character, should not be obedience to authority, nor should it be moral duty or obligation to our fellow human beings. Children cannot conceive of duty, he thinks, and to try to teach them this too early invites hypocrisy. Here's a quote from Emile. He says, "What results from this? Firstly, by imposing on them a duty that they do not feel, you set against them your tyranny and turn them away from loving you. Secondly, you teach them to become liars, fakers, in order to extort rewards or escape punishments. Finally, by accustoming them always to cover a secret motive with an apparent motive, you yourselves give them the means of deceiving you ceaselessly, of depriving you of the knowledge of their true character, and of fobbing you and others off with vain words when the occasion serves." Our right to that with which we mix our labor, our property right, is to be taught before any duty as immediately understandable once the youth works on his small plot of land. So Rousseau, while ultimately rejecting bourgeois selfishness as too low of a motivation, still starts out in early childhood with the promotion of simple self-interest, which can be extended to others as a rudimentary understanding of rights. We should cultivate an abiding, healthy self-interest, or, more accurately, extended self-interest. Far from being able to understand, let alone abide by, a verbal commitment, a child can understand ownership over his own property and work due to the benefits they yield. and he can understand why others would want to do the same. Rousseau disagrees with the idea that self-interest, or at least a healthy interest in self before others, necessarily leads to selfishness. If done in the right way, he thinks the youth will learn over time that coming to others' aid gives him pleasure and increases his friendships, and he will willingly help when he is able. But how do we teach children to go beyond this healthy and natural self-interest and understanding of rights to true kindness or altruism, a sense which Rousseau is very keen to instill? He states that just because Emile's parents require him to do charitable works does not mean he will understand the value of charity. But he also says that the child can learn slowly to emulate the charitable acts of his elders. For promoting kindness in children, it is better for the teacher to be an example to his pupil, and the morals he should model are simple. Rousseau writes, "Be just, humane, and beneficent. Give not only alms, give charity. Works of mercy relieve more ills than does money. Love others, and they will love you." Rousseau disagrees with Locke that one should arrange things so that the child sees that the most generous people are always rewarded for their generosity, saying that this will produce an undesirable mercenary character in the child's charitable activities. He can see that Locke's attention to self-interest goes too far, and yet, in his own answer to the problems of charity, all he can muster at this point is, man is an imitator. If we cannot instill a sense of duty and thus honor in children, but we need to go beyond self-interest, then in his view we must appeal to children's imitative nature for some relief. We must wait until the nearing of adulthood to find a better pathway to the charitable heart. So, while Rousseau says that duty is something that children and youth cannot understand, he appeals to reciprocity for the achievement of positive early results. The pathway to obligation for the young must be habit, reciprocity, and, as we've seen, a sort of empathy or fellow feeling, in which a person simply feels an emotion based upon seeing the poor plight of somebody else. Rousseau says, quote, "The only lesson of morality appropriate to childhood, and the most important for every age, is never to harm anyone." End quote. This is a lesson which goes a long way toward the development of empathy in his view. This is a particularly salutary teaching because adults have a tendency to put the good before doing no harm and cause much harm in the name of good. Doing no harm can sometimes be taught by direct consequences, and as we know, Rousseau thinks it is also something that is planted naturally in the human heart, to feel empathy upon seeing another member of our species suffer. Thus, empathy, as a foundation for morality, is not at all hard to teach children, he says. It only needs to be encouraged by putting them in the right situations. So we can see that Rousseau thought a lot about how young children ought to be raised and that they should not be left very much to their own devices, but they had their limitations. The moral character was not going to develop too much in a child beyond making sure that their habits were shaped appropriately and that you are a good role model. He waits until that time between childhood and adulthood to step in and teach more about morality and honor. So I think I'll continue with this, and we'll get into that in-between age and how he deals with that next week. Okay, bye.